During the 8 years before the outbreak of America's Civil War, two men, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, were inaugurated as presidents of the United States. This was an extremely unsettled time in American history due to rising anger and frustration over the issue of the expansion of slavery. The nation was becoming increasingly divided between South and North, between Free State and Slave State, and neither Pierce nor Buchanan was able to keep the Union from falling apart. Franklin Pierce, America's 14th president, was a lawyer and a Democrat from the state of New Hampshire. Before becoming president, Pierce had represented his state here in the nation's capital, in both the Senate and House of Representatives, and he had served as an officer in the Mexican War as well. After being elected president, Franklin Pierce had to confront two major national problems. One was the growing opposition to the expansion of slavery, and the other was a rising tide of prejudice against new immigrants who were arriving in the country each day by the thousands. But in spite of these enormous problems, the era of Franklin Pierce was a time of great prosperity for the United States, due in part to the recent discovery of gold in California. It was a time when huge numbers of pioneers loaded their possessions into covered wagons and headed down the Oregon Trail to start new lives in the western wilderness. A time when paddle-wheeled steamboats loaded with bales of cotton and other goods chugged majestically up and down America's great rivers. A time when big factories dominated much of life in the New England states by providing steady jobs for those willing to work long hours at noisy machines. And it was also a time when some people were starting to plan new railroad routes that would soon span the entire North American continent. When President Franklin Pierce moved into the White House in 1853, only a few years had passed since the nation had acquired its lands along the Pacific Ocean. At that time, there was still no railroad line to the West Coast, but people knew that as soon as one could be built, a cross-country trip could be made in less than a week. As it stood, most passengers and trade goods from the Atlantic coast had to travel by ship around the tip of South America, so that a voyage of several months was required to reach the harbor of San Francisco from eastern ports. Back then, land surveyors believed that one of the most practical routes for a railroad to California would pass through the hot desert land south of the Gila River in today's state of Arizona. However, in early 1853, that land still belonged to Mexico. But later that year, Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna sold America this region, called the Gadsden Purchase, for $10 million. And as a result of the Gadsden Purchase, over 29,000 square miles of land, or nearly 77,000 square kilometers, were added to the country. While new land was being acquired for a southern railroad route, Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas proposed the creation of a northern railroad route to the Pacific that would run west from the growing city of Chicago. Douglas knew that a northern railroad route would be of great financial benefit to his home state of Illinois, and a northern railroad route would run through the unorganized territory in the center of the country, bringing rapid settlement to that area as well. Back then, this region was home to several large Native American tribes and the huge herds of buffalo upon which they depended for food. To win the approval of voters from the southern slave states for a northern railroad route, the creation of two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, was proposed. Douglas wanted them to be places where popular sovereignty would exist, meaning that if the settlers in these territories wanted slavery, they could have it. And so, with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, the Missouri Compromise, the law that had kept slavery out of the North for 34 years, was repealed. In response to its passage, a group of people in Wisconsin founded the Republican Party. Its main purpose was to support politicians like Abraham Lincoln, who sought to end slavery in America. People who struggled to bring an end to slavery, such as the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, and ex-slaves Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, were typical of the countless reformers that were active in America during the first half of the 19th century. These reformers, both men and women, worked hard not only to rid the nation of the evils of slavery, but also to improve education, improve the lives of the poor, improve conditions in the factories, improve the treatment of the mentally ill, improve the rights of women, and so forth. Some reformers even established ideal communities where people came to improve themselves by living and working together in peace and harmony. For they believed that if the conditions under which people lived were improved, ordinary human beings could accomplish truly amazing things. For example, a religious group known as the Shakers founded several ideal communities that at one time were home to as many as 6,000 people. Here, at Pleasant Hill in Kentucky, hundreds of Shakers shared housing and meals and practiced nonviolence, purity, and equality. In 1857, while the reformers worked to improve American society, James Buchanan, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, took the oath of office as America's 15th president. Only 2 days after President Buchanan was inaugurated, Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney issued a series of rulings called the Dred Scott decision that would come to have a tremendous impact on the future of the United States. Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri. He had filed a lawsuit asking the court to grant him his freedom on the grounds that many years earlier his owner had taken him to live for an extended period in a territory where slavery was illegal under the Missouri Compromise. This was the 1820 law, repealed in 1854, that had permitted slavery in Missouri as long as it was outlawed in territories north of what was called the Missouri Compromise line. When they issued the Dred Scott decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional because it had illegally deprived slave owners of their right to own a certain kind of property, that is, their slaves, in the northern territories. In other words, the court said that Dred Scott had based his case on an unconstitutional law, and thus it had no merit. In addition, the Supreme Court went on to repeal laws that restricted the rights of American citizens to own slaves in the new U.S. territories, such as Kansas and Nebraska. Furthermore, the court ruled that blacks, even if they weren't slaves, were not allowed to be U.S. citizens. Therefore, they said, Dred Scott should never have been allowed to file a lawsuit in the first place. President Buchanan supported the decision in the Dred Scott case, and it was hailed as a great victory for the pro-slavery forces of the South. But Northerners reacted to it angrily, calling it a wicked and false judgment. And the Republican Party said that the Dred Scott decision clearly showed that slave owners were plotting to use the Constitution to achieve their goal of expanding slavery in the United States. In 1858, The year after the Dred Scott decision was issued, Minnesota entered the Union as a free state. Gold was discovered in Colorado, and the Butterfield Overland Stage Line began to operate a regular stagecoach service between Missouri and California, and the journey took 3 weeks. 1858 was also the year of the Lincoln-Douglas debates over slavery that took place during the race for the U.S. Senate in Illinois. On one side was the Democratic candidate for senator, Stephen Douglas. On the opposing side was Abraham Lincoln, the Republican senatorial candidate. Lincoln was opposed to slavery on the grounds that it was a great moral evil. Lincoln tried to convince voters that Stephen Douglas was not to be trusted because he was the man behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act that had made slavery possible in territories where it had been previously illegal. Douglas believed that American citizens should be free to decide if they wanted to have slavery without having government interference. He warned that Lincoln's ideas on racial equality were dangerous and misguided. In the end, Lincoln's moral stand against slavery brought him to the attention of the entire nation, but even at that, Douglas won the race for senator. And the next year, 1859, another free state, Oregon, was admitted to the Union as America's 33rd state. Out of the 4 candidates that ran for president in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln of Illinois won the most votes. About a month after the election, fearing that Lincoln would bring about an end to slavery, South Carolina seceded, that is, broke away from the United States. At that time, President Buchanan was still in charge of the country, due to the fact that Lincoln's inauguration was still 10 weeks away. Buchanan didn't want to send troops to South Carolina, and decided to wait to see what would happen next. In the meantime, another new state, Kansas, was admitted to the Union. Buchanan's decision not to use force in South Carolina proved to be a big mistake, because before Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861, 6 other slave states, Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, had seceded from the Union as well. They called themselves the Confederate States of America. And by the end of the year, the Confederates would be joined by North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Virginia as well. A few days after South Carolina broke away from the Union, a small garrison of U.S. Army troops left Fort Moultrie, just outside of Charleston, and moved to Fort Sumter, a short distance away across the harbor. When South Carolina officials demanded that the U.S. troops leave Fort Sumter, they refused. In response, on April 12, 1861, Confederate troops opened fire on Fort Sumter as the citizens of Charleston watched on in horrified disbelief. And so began a 4-year civil war that would bring about the deaths of 620,000 American soldiers. True or false? The Gadsden Purchase added land to America's Northwest region. True or false? The Kansas-Nebraska Act outlawed slavery in the new U.S. territories. True or false? The Dred Scott decision ended America's Civil War. True or false? President Buchanan decided not to use military force to keep the Union together. True or false? The Republican Party was founded to help stop the spread of slavery.